I recently had the great fortune to travel to the US Naval War College to find out more about naval history and naval wargaming. Over the next few weeks, I'll be sharing what I discovered. This includes tours of the museum, as well as interviews with key individuals like historian Craig Simons, museum curator Rob Doan, wargame designer Pete Pellegrino, and director of the Hattendorf Historical Center, Dr. David Conan. In this video, I'll provide you with a quick overview of the campus and conclude with a tour of the facilities. So for starters, where is the US Naval War College? Well, it's located in Rhode Island on a small coastal island right next to Newport, just under an hour away from the main airport in Providence. The area is absolutely beautiful and well worth a visit to enjoy the beaches, seascape, old mansions, and adorable downtown area. Okay, so what is the US Naval War College? Well, it's an institution with three main activities: academics, research, and wargaming. On the academics front, it's basically a staff college which serves as a postgraduate education program primarily for military officers of the US Navy, though select international military personnel and government civilians may attend. On the research front, the Naval War College looks both into the past and the future. Its library and historical collection contain a huge number of archives, manuscripts, oral histories, and special collections. In addition, numerous research centers focus on specific topics like unconventional conflicts, legal implications of national and international confrontation, and how history informs contemporary decision-making. The Center for Naval Warfare Studies in particular is dedicated to studying and informing the Navy's contribution to national strategy. And finally, on the wargaming front, the US Naval War College is the place to be for this kind of action. The college has numerous facilities to host complex war simulations from sea to space to cyber, with the goal of not only enriching their educational curriculum, but also helping to shape defense plans and policies for various agencies. The history of wargaming runs deep at the college, dating back to the 1880s, and will be the subject of several of our follow-up videos. So yeah, there's a ton going on at the US Naval War College. With this context in mind, let's now retrace the steps of my trip. I was there for 2.5 days with access to these areas of campus. Generally, only the museum is open to the public, and travel beyond that point requires you to have some form of supervision. It's also worth noting that access to the base requires some advanced paperwork that has to be submitted before your arrival, so keep that in mind if you plan on visiting. Anyways, my first day was spent touring the US Naval War College Museum. It's an awesome building dedicated to the history of the US Navy and the Naval War College. Guided tours are provided and the staff there is excellent. I'll be uploading an entire recorded tour provided by the museum curator in a separate video for your perusal. Suffice to say, it's got a ton of great content worth checking out. Next, I was escorted across campus by wargame designer Pete Pellegrino to visit the major wargaming facilities and follow the development of wargaming from the 19th to the 21st centuries. We began outside on Dewey Field for a quick intro to the tour. Unfortunately, the area does tend to get quite windy, so our audio recording was rough. I'll provide commentary for this section to save your ears from the pain. The tour begins with the story of Founders Hall. It was the first building purchased by the Naval War College and therefore the first place where wargaming started. When the college opened in 1884, instructors wanted programs that combined both theory and practice. And just behind us here is the Narragansett Bay, which was going to be the practice part of this curriculum. And right up until the turn of the century, the Navy could actually bring in its warships from the North Atlantic Squadron and practice in the bay. So some of those theories that the students were learning up in the classroom would actually be put into practice right in the bay. However, what ended up happening is that the Navy administration found that these live exercises were a huge waste of time and money, and especially didn't want the Atlantic Squadron pulled away from active duty. Thus, rather early on in the college's history, they lost access to the use of actual ships and had to find some form of replacement when it came to the study of naval maneuvers. Luckily, in 1886, Lieutenant William McCarty Little brought a new technique to the school involving maps on which you could move miniature ships around for study. This early wargaming drew on the precedents of Prussian Kriegspiel from a few decades earlier, as well as notable naval thinkers like John Clarke of Eldon, England. At first, this wargaming started off as just a technique used in lectures in 1884 and 85, but by 1887, there was actually a full-blown wargaming portion of the curriculum. and it would continue back here in Founders Hall for quite some time. However, eventually, the class sizes that were growing at the Naval War College meant that the program just simply outgrew this small space, and now had to move on to Luce Hall. So let's head on over there.
So now we're here by Luce Hall. Luce Hall is the first purpose-built building on campus for the War College. We began teaching here in 1892. We moved from Founders into Luce Hall. Luce Hall has classroom, office space, dormitory space for students, so it's the complete college more or less in this building at the time. And this is where, starting in about 1894, this is the wargaming becomes the curriculum technique for teaching. Before, when we're over here in Founders, it's a few lectures are taught using what would look like early wargaming techniques as an instructional method. By the time we get to 1894, it is the instructional method. All of the courses taught at the college will be taught in a wargaming framework. So typically what you'll see from this, starting at this point through leading up to World War II, the technique is to present the students with a problem on the wargaming floor, and they'll do the gaming either in the morning and then discuss in the afternoon, or potentially game all day, or start in the afternoon and talk the next morning. But every lesson is reinforced by a gaming segment. And the gaming itself becomes the key mechanism for delivery. So when we talk about, well, to ask someone, did they wargame at the college in those early years? It would have been, well, yeah, it's all we do at the college is wargame.
The scope and scale of those is more like scenarios, small engagements.
Tactical through the strategic. Okay. We do both. When I talk about the interwar period lecturing, you'll see how they divided up the time. Basically, there were tactical games and strategic games. The curriculum at the time ran almost a full year, close to 320 some days of curriculum, and all but a handful were devoted to gaming. It would take the students about a month just to learn how to play the game. Okay. With demo games and practice sessions, and then also just the learning how to use some of the gaming tools. That was about a month's worth of classwork, was just learning that portion. And then we're into tactical gaming for a series of 6 games, depends on the class. Strategic games for about as many. Then we're towards the tail end of the curriculum when we're looking at historic stuff like the Battle of Jutland. The students often were given a problem called the Battle of Sable Island, which essentially took the Battle of Jutland, lifted it out of the North Sea, moved it off to the coast of Nova Scotia, and took the Germans out and put the Americans in. All right, so you still fought against the British off the coast of Nova Scotia. That was called the Battle of Sable Island. But again, all part of the instructional techniques. There's a week's worth of critiquing, past performances, and finally they had to do what were called the quick decision games, where unlike the previous games where there's a fair amount of preparation before the students play, in this case, they're essentially just said, okay, and here's the problem, you're the commander, go. And you had to think on your feet and immediately put together a battle plan and fight the fight. So Luce Hall is the site of all of that, basically almost all of that interwar gaming is done here. So when we talk about Nimitz and his experiences leading up to World War II and wargaming and how that contributed to his success in the Pacific, he's the class of 1923. He's in here. In Luce Hall. Now, the actual wargaming facilities in here are long gone. They've been converted into office spaces and there's really nothing to see. However, from Luce, we then move in 1934 to Pringle Hall. So the tail end of the interwar period is done in Pringle, and Pringle still has remnants that you can see of the original game floor. So let's head inside of Pringle Hall. So Luce Hall opens in 1892. And we moved the course from Founders Hall, the original building, here. Luce Hall is a complete setup in terms of it includes classroom, wargaming, office space, as well as dormitory space for the students. So we're now inside of Luce Hall, and the old wargaming spaces have been repurposed as part of our international students' wardroom, but you can still see elements of the old gaming floor. And so we're going to go into the wardroom and take a look around. So Luce Hall was one of the remodels, took the original gaming floor, which is what we're standing on now. And there is some debate if we were to pull up the carpet, would we find the original checkerboard floor, or was that floor removed before it was recarpeted? We don't know, and no one's willing to tear up carpet to find out. But should we remodel the space again, we'll find out. But where we're standing now would have been the game floor, tiled off as traditional time period. Up above here in this balcony area, you see that you'd have observation platforms to be able to look down on the game, as well as some of these offices originally were planning spaces where the students would go and gather as a team, plan, come out, do maneuvers as part of the wargaming process. At the time when Pringle is built and with this wargaming facility, it is considered the most technologically advanced at the time. Now again, we're talking about 1934 by the time we get here into Pringle Hall from Luce Hall. So here in Pringle Hall, the wargaming system is using pneumatic tubes to teleport orders around to different game cells. We've got a variety of scorekeeping boards and mechanisms, but fundamentally, the game is still being played with models on the floor. We're using turning templates, chalk to mark maneuvers, and the battle is played out in 3-minute segments. The students submit orders to the umpires move the ships, and at the time, as we start gaming into this period of history, a couple of things have happened to wargaming that represent some shifts in thinking. Prior to about 1922, so we're still gaming in Luce Hall before we come over here to Pringle, but up to about 1922, the wargaming is fairly simple. And the idea is about maneuver, and taking the time to differentiate one ship from another doesn't seem to be particularly useful. So a US dreadnought has the exact same performance characteristics as a British dreadnought, as a German dreadnought, as anybody's dreadnought. Same as would be true of the destroyers, the frigates. Any ship is basically only modeled at its class level and doesn't really try to reflect what may be truly happening in terms of advanced capabilities out on the water. Wargaming itself isn't just a military activity. It's a huge, popular civilian activity. And people like Fred Jane, who will later go on to become Jane's publishing empire, and Fletcher Pratt are folks who are civilians who have a keen interest in naval warfare and are promoting it as a hobby activity. So you have places like the ballroom, the Astoria Ballroom in New York City, where couples will come to spend an evening. I have to think it was the husband that was getting more out of this than the wife. But couples would come and they would join with dozens of other couples and bring their ships and put them all on the floor and spend an evening waging a massive naval battle. At the time, there was a joke about you could tell someone who had been at one of these big war games because they had chalk on their cheeks from getting down on the floor, peering through those little turrets to see if they got a hit or not, and would pick up chalk on their cheeks. As a matter of fact, that gaming has so much more detail than official military gaming that there is a phrase at the end of one of our early rule books that says that these rules have been written to basically simplify and make the game more accessible to junior officers. And if a more detailed study is required to include armor penetration, types of guns, then the Navy suggested you go play one of these other games. Fred Jane's, particularly the Fred Jane game, the Jane's War game. So we kind of have a shift that occurs after the Battle of Jutland, basically. And while there's nothing specific that says, oh, they looked at Battle of Jutland and decided the rules were out of date, the college did have a practice of constantly updating the rules. There would be a naval battle. That would be a feedback mechanism to say, hey, do we need to change the rules so that we can represent what actually happened in the battle? So there you have a feedback loop that goes back and forth. That feedback loop in 1922 produces a new set of rules, and from that point on, the rules get more and more complicated. A result of complicated rules in a pre-computer era is time. So while I may say that, okay, I want you to plot your maneuver for your fleet over the next 3 minutes, it could take a half hour for the umpires to try to work out what exactly all that meant when it came to going to the gunfire tables and going to the various capability tables and plotting the ship movements and whatnot. So there's a bit of an overhead burden that comes with wargaming. And here in Pringle, they try to ameliorate some of that with things like rapid transfer of orders using pneumatic tubes and some other non-computing devices that they could wrestle with in the 1930s. But we're going to game here in Pringle Hall until we acquire the next building, which is Sims Hall, which we acquire in 1947. It's originally a barracks, and you can tell from its shape, it's got a very, wings, and you can imagine sailors living there. We acquire it in 47, and really starting in about 1957, when the computer comes on the scene, is when we shift our gaming from Pringle Hall to Sims Hall. And that starts the age of the computer and computing in gaming. And we'll go over and look at the gaming floor there, and we can talk a little bit about where computers did and did not deliver. So while most of the interwar period gaming is done in Pringle Hall up through, so again, remember we acquired Pringle in 1934, so we're doing, so we've done Luce gaming for interwar period up to 34, then we're in Pringle Hall from 34. We acquire this building, Sims Hall, former barracks, in 1947. Now, the challenge with Sims is we get it, but we don't really have a specific gaming need for it at the time. Now, we are getting larger games, and what we decided to do is we use this gaming floor for a lot of logistics gaming. So, and again, old photographs of a game going on here in Sims Hall. So initially this is more like overflow space. So we're still using Pringle, but this is our overflow space. In 1957 though, we acquire the Naval Electronic Warfare System, NEWS, the first computer-based gaming system. And Sims Hall is perfect in that it has lots of wings, lots of room, and we're able to go and install the mainframe computer, create planning spaces, and use this space then as a gaming space. With the computer though, you would be thinking of all of that overhead that was taking the umpires 30 minutes to go through or longer in our old manual rules is now digitized and it should go so much faster. Yes and no. Like many advanced computing systems of its day, it tended to overpromise, underdeliver. So we still had issues with speed. The computer is not necessarily fast. And perhaps one of the biggest problems that begins to become apparent with computer-based gaming is that the students are losing some tactile sense of gaming. So when you have a game and I put a combat result table in front of you, and you can see as you look at the odds and the probability of success, and you can see how on the table, oh, there's clearly a break point here, where when the odds go to 3 to 1, it's significantly better for me. The table begins to give you a certain sense of transparency as far as the likelihood of outcomes. When all that same mathematics are hidden inside of the computer,
yeah, it's a black box.
It's a black box. You put in your move, and the computer comes back and says hit or miss. And you don't really get that sense of, well, how much did I miss by? I mean, was it just a bad roll of the dice? Or was my tactic fundamentally flawed? Hard to tell. So as we continue to improve the computer gaming, as we get into the 1970s, the president of the War College, at the time, President Turner, actually holds back on another round of computer upgrades because of this loss of tactile sense with regard to risk and probability, and wants the computer to have much more of a transparent, again, back to almost the digital version of that combat result table. He wants to see that sonar beam sweep out and listen and collect. He wants the players to get a sense of the digital die being cast and understanding the probability and risk. And he wants more games, because at the time the curriculum begins to shift. It's going away from being gaming centric. And it lost a lot of its gaming centricness after World War II. And Turner realizes that it's a bit of a loss. And while at the one hand he wants to push the college to having a much more of a curriculum to be recognized at any large liberal university at the time, he doesn't want to lose that opportunity for the students to fight in a war game. And the computer gaming tends to be slower overall in that you can't do as many games as quickly. When I'm using ships on the floor, I can quickly reset the ships on the floor to everybody get back to start positions. I can't just quickly go over to the computer and reset the game. It takes a while to get the computer to be reprogrammed and reset for another run, whereas you can do it on the floor very quickly. So manual gaming does give you a certain flexibility that we didn't have in that early time period. So while the computer holds out great promise, it doesn't exactly deliver. And the curriculum begins to move away from tactical level, which is what the computer was really optimized for. And we're starting to look at more and more operational strategic level issues, which don't tend to lend themselves to the computer gaming at the time. So when we move out of Sims Hall and go to McCarty Little Hall in 1999, no computer goes over with us really. And what we do is we continue to use other software to support gaming, but it's not computer-centric like it was in the 50s and 60s particularly. Now, some of the massive games we did in the 1980s and 90s wouldn't have been possible without a computer. In terms of being able to distribute play over multiple sites for multiple players. And our large, then what were called the Global Wargaming series, definitely needed the computer for the distributed nature of the conflict and the players. But again, now at McCarty Little Hall, we don't use model and simulation-based approaches are not the center of the gaming engine, if you will. So this is Sims Hall, again, the last place before McCarty Little was built. And again, you can see the old gantry. Observer seats there for the commander and his executive officer to be able to watch play being executed on the floor below. So with that, we'll head over to McCarty Little.
As we walked over to McCarty Little Hall, I was actually told that this was the most modern of facilities with a lot of modern activity taking place. Therefore, for the sake of security, we were required to move all electronic equipment prior to entering. Now, while I won't be able to share with you any footage, I can describe what's inside. So basically, the building is filled with lots of offices and meeting rooms, with the main hall for wargaming. This room is basically a gym-sized computer room. The walls are mounted with large TV screens, and the center is filled with tons of wheeled desks and chairs that can be moved around into different configurations depending on the scenario being wargamed. Each of these stations can then be outfitted with its own computers as needed, which are then all wired below the panels of the raised floor. Additionally, large dividers can be drawn across the room to separate its spaces. This all allows the room to be split up into endless configurations to meet the needs of a particular wargame. Apparently, such games can involve anywhere from just a dozen or so students running something like an exercise, to upwards of 100 high-level commanders and support staff waging classified level warfare. So yeah, it was quite impressive. But after a few minutes, we were ushered out and the tour concluded. I went on to conduct many follow-up interviews and discussions over the next 2 days with regards to wargaming and naval history. So stay tuned for that content coming up next. And if you do decide to check out the US Naval War College, make sure that you check in on the procedures required, because it's not just a case of showing up at the door and walking in. However, if you do make it inside, definitely give a big hello to the museum staff and all the staff. They are super great. They rolled out the red carpets for me, and I'm sure they will do the same for you as well. So yeah, take care and enjoy.